Welcome to the Relational Recovery Podcast. I'm your host, Wes Thompson, joined by my co-host, Austin Hill. Today, we're in part 2 of Why Grace is Essential in Addiction. We hope this conversation is helpful. Thanks for listening. Hey, Austin.
Hey, Wes. How are you?
Good. We're going to do a part 2 on grace. Why grace is essential in addiction. I just want to do something different and open up with some prayer. God, we just thank you, Jesus, that you're a God of grace. This is a complicated topic for us because I think we live in a world where often relationships are transactional. So we are good to people that are good to us. And grace is this idea that you're good to us when we deserve the opposite. And so God, teach us how we can live a life of grace. Show us what it means to receive grace. Show us what it means to show grace to others. And we thank you that you are a loving God, and just continue to teach us and train us that we would be healthy people and grow in these areas and ultimately find not only sobriety, but healthy relationships with you, others in the world around us. Amen. Well, I know last conversation we talked in just big overview. We've got five bullet points here of why grace is essential, and there's other things that we can talk about, but we just jump in with some practical things. Because again, as I said in the prayer, right, when we're talking about grace, we're talking about goodness. You know, God's goodness towards us when we deserve punishment. And it's a really radical concept because, right, you think about like when we do a behavior and that behavior would lend itself to be bad and to deserve something negative, which consequences are a part of life. But there's also this component of grace where, you know, oftentimes difficult things can be, or difficult decisions or mistakes can be an opportunity for us to grow. And so grace is like the goodness and the pain. And pain and suffering is a part of life, and we might get to that a little bit later, but grace is essential for us to navigate life well and to navigate recovery well, because as we've often said on this podcast, and anyone who understands addiction, it's not a linear path. In other words, addiction's not, hey, you know, this behavior or this substance or whatever, like consume my life and then boom, in an instant, it's better. It's a gradual up and down, messy dynamic where oftentimes relapse and struggle and pain are a part of the process. Anybody who's trying to change their life, like that's a component of it. You think about like how many diets do people go on? Like there's rarely a moment in someone's life when they're like, you know, I want to be healthy, and then they're healthy and they don't ever do anything unhealthy again. Like as human beings, there's a lot of stops and starts with how we engage in the world. And that's not to say that we should celebrate our failures, but rather to first acknowledge that we aren't perfect. And so because we're not perfect, grace is necessary. So before we jump off, like, is there anything you want to say to kind of respond to that or to set this up, or does that hit you in any specific way?
I don't know. I think that teed up the conversation really well. Grace is I think a really important thing to keep in mind is that grace is something that we receive and something we give. It's not one-sided. It's not something that we should just like, I need grace and I just need to take it from others, and it's not something that I alone have to give out to others. We usually personally fall on one side of that, one or the other side of that kind of mindset of I am deserving of grace and it's easy for me to receive it, or I only give it away and I have a hard time receiving it.
Yeah. I'm curious how you'd respond to this, because we've said this before, but I know in my life, I think that it's really hard to give grace to others if we haven't first received it for ourselves. In other words, if we're incredibly self-critical, incredibly self-condemning, really rigid with ourselves in a way that breeds a lot of just toxic shame and exaggerated guilt. I think it's really hard to extend grace to anybody else if I'm not receiving it from God, receiving it from others. It can be a really difficult dynamic. I don't know. How does that show up for you?
Not trying to be contrarian, exact opposite when I'm unhealthy. Like I can think to the past, where I would be joyfully giving away grace to people who were just treating me like crap. Like, oh, but like that's how God did things. That's how Jesus did things. So I should just, let people treat me like a welcome man. Like you and I have I think we've talked about this just like in our own personal conversations, where being kind doesn't mean letting people treat you like a doormat. It's, having those healthy boundaries and knowing that I have value. But how I experience grace, I got so much out of forgiveness and giving people the opportunity to fail. Like that's a healthy side of it. But for some reason, I didn't think I deserved it. And it was this, like what you said, like this hyper rigidity for myself, and absolutely like, no holds bar, laissez-faire for everyone else. So it's weird. It's like the thing that I showed people that I valued, or the thing that I showed people the most was this like open-handed gesture of like, if Jesus showed me grace and I know how messed up I am, then I should just freely give it. But I skipped that in between part of believing that Jesus showed me grace because he loves me. Because I could see how he loved other people. But for the life of me, I was just like, why would he like me? Which sounds really like, when you dig in, it is a navel-gazing, self-centered way of looking at life, where like, this is for everyone but me, because I am uniquely messed up. So, but like, so that's been weird. That's why like grace is a weird topic. It's complicated.
Yeah, it's interesting. That's interesting. So you really struggled to show it to yourself, but it was easy to show it to others. And maybe anyone listening can maybe pause and just think like, how does that dynamic show up in your life? Because, it's just Austin and I talking with each other right now, but you've already heard like how we experience grace is different than each other. And so you listening, it's probably going to be different for you. But the reality, I think, is this, like we all are in need of grace. Nobody's perfect. And so we're all going to struggle with this dynamic of dealing with failure, of dealing with like, we have a standard that we want to live by, but not adhering to that perfectly. And others, you're not adhering to it perfectly. And I think oftentimes with others, it sounds like this wasn't your struggle maybe as much as mine, but like I know in the past, I have a pretty high threshold, for people, but I think once my thresholds hit, it's really hard for me to move beyond that. In other words, I feel like I'm pretty forgiving and grace-filled until a certain threshold is reached. And once it's crossed, like it's really hard for me to go back. And so there's certain relationships in my life where I've had to really work hard at forgiveness and grace and continue to receive it myself, and what's really helped me is doing a lot of deep reflection work on, man, there's certain things I'm strong at and there's certain things I really struggle with. And just to reflect on, man, how patient God has been with me in those particular struggles that don't go away quick, and that maybe I'm doing good for a while and then I slip up and I'm like, man, I've come back to God with this struggle time and time and time and time again. And his patience, not saying there's not correction, not saying there's not discipline, not saying there's not consequence at times, but the patience that God has displayed to us and to me, I think is fuel for how we might interact with the people in our lives. Because that's a hard thing to keep showing up, right? When when we lose trust in other people or when we lose trust in ourselves. So this is, like you said, it's harder to practice than it might sound on the surface, but it's it's one of the most powerful, I think, realities in our human experience, is to really live out what it means to be a grace-filled person.
Yeah. Like if you think about what grace looks like in action, health, like appropriate grace, it doesn't mean we ignore sin or struggle. That's not grace. So it's just like if someone is struggling with something, being a gracious person doesn't mean, oh, we don't talk about that. We just ignore it. We forgive them internally, but we don't point it out. What grace is, it's about creating the environment where confession becomes the healing instead of humiliating. Does that make sense? Like, so
Yeah, man.
if you are in a spot where you are able to confess something to someone and it's safe enough where you know, it's like, oh, this is going to be tough, but I'm going to say it. I'm going to express these things. And the person you're sharing shows grace by not humiliating or shaming you, but it's and also not giving you a pass. It's I am safe enough in this relationship to be fully transparent about a painful topic and know that that person loves me enough to stick with me through that struggle or sin or pain and not be okay with the fact that it happened. It's like hey, you shouldn't treat people like, a jerk. Don't be a jerk. Like, don't be rude. A gracious person isn't like, oh, I'm going to just forgive them. Allow them to just treat people poorly. Like if someone's rude to the server at a restaurant or rude to strangers on the street, a gracious person isn't like, oh, that's just who they are. I'm going to love them for who they are. It's like, dude, don't be a dick. Treat people with kindness. That's gracious. I mean, like, I'm saying this because I love you. That's gracious.
Yeah, grace is evident not only in the softness that we tend to, I think, associate it with, but like having those hard conversations, right? Because we love somebody. We want goodness for them, right? If we go back to the definition, goodness towards those who don't deserve it. Well, sometimes the good thing that I need, that you need, that we all need is sometimes a rebuke, like someone that loves me enough to know that, man, what's good for me in that moment is challenge. And this really dovetails in, I alluded to 5 points before, and what you just said, I think, really speaks into the first bullet point, which is like grace allows for honesty. In other words, a safe place to confess without condemnation. And that's exactly, I think, what you were alluding to a minute ago. I mean, many of us struggle with honesty, and oftentimes that's a trust issue, but I find there to be a really big correlation with trust and with grace.
Say more. What do you mean?
Yeah, I think if we haven't experienced grace in our lives, if grace hasn't been modeled in those like foundational relationships, like especially with family or with, influential people in our lives growing up, it's hard to be honest because we expect people to treat us harshly when we fail. We don't expect goodness. Goodness maybe isn't a category. Again, even that hard goodness, like when somebody challenges us but wants good for us, like we a lot of us experience like, man, failure's not an option, mistakes aren't an option. Like we're not going to talk through it. We're not going to learn from it. We're just going to, there's oftentimes like the consequences are just, you get the cold shoulder, you get verbally assaulted, you get, maybe even physically, beaten or something, there's a whole spectrum of non-gracious experiences that we've all had. And that tends to affect how we trust others. And so grace and trust, I think, kind of go, there's kind of overlap there. But if we live in a grace-filled environment, it allows for honesty because I can say hard things. I can admit failure and struggle if I trust and know that the other person or persons want what's best for me, want good for me. And if I believe, Austin, like if I come to you and I believe you want good for me, I'm going to feel more safe to confess and be honest. But if my conditioning is such that I think everybody's out to get me, it's going to be really hard to be honest. And that's not a gracious environment to be in. And sometimes we do that to others. We're not gracious. So people don't feel safe enough to be honest with us.
Yeah. The other side, I think if we just might, maybe through this whole list, we might do the either ors with both of all these topics.
Yeah.
I think if you have a hard time giving, giving that grace out, is one side. The other one is like, you're just giving it all the time, which is like being a gracious person is giving grace, but knowing that it's not a open door to whatever happens. So if because it is a part of a relationship to be a gracious person. So if someone takes advantage of that again and again and again, because I think if we think through our lives, like there was someone who took advantage of our kindness or our vulnerability, like you said, so like if I mess up or if I'm vulnerable and express that I messed up in that way, and the reaction I got or grew up with was this explosion and punishment and condemnation and like, you'll never amount to anything because you screwed up this one little thing. So everything's a failure because you did this one thing wrong. Of course, I'm not going to share more.
Yeah, that's not going to feel very safe.
It's not going to help. But if my reaction to that was, well, I'm just going to share everything and hope that one day they might see something. Like, if I did 9 out of 10 things wrong, hopefully one day someone will see that one thing I did right. So I'm just going to, we talk about like being just word vomit on everybody, hoping that one day someone would like me because I'm connecting my worth to perfection. So it's just like this weird opposite reaction where it almost feels like if I am not showing grace to this person to treat me poorly, if I'm ever on guard or I just, have a good boundary with someone who's been mean, who's been like vindictive and hurtful on purpose. If I put this boundary in place, that's not gracious. That's not true. It is gracious to be appropriately on guard with people who have broken your trust, because this isn't like grace isn't just about like, oh, I break people's trust and so I have to seek grace from others. Like there's sometimes people have broken trust with you and you have to be guarded with certain people. And
some people aren't safe. Yeah. Some people aren't safe.
Yeah, they aren't. And that does not mean you're not being gracious. So there's that tension there.
Yep. That's a good point for sure. So I think if we're listening, like we want to be a place where people can be real. In other words, they can be where they are. That doesn't mean we condone it. They can be imperfect. But the goal is that we're not lavishing condemnation on others, right? But we're also not condoning harmful behavior. And so I think it requires a patience and a curiosity to be like, because I think often our response to others is that's wrong, stop it. Especially in recovery.
Yeah.
And that's definitely part of
teaching.
it.
Yeah.
So that's definitely part of it. But I think it's being curious enough to really love the person and show them goodness by asking questions like what's that harmful behavior in service of? Like what am I trying to get from that behavior? And is there a way to redirect it towards a more healthy and whole way? Like, am I trying to find something in this harmful behavior that I need to find in a healthy relationship and in God and in community? And so can we slow down the condemnation, anger stuff in us enough to be curious with ourselves and others so that we can aim to grow. Okay. So second point, because we're going to take all day if we do this. So first point, right? Grace allows for honesty. Secondly, and we've alluded to this, but grace holds space for failure. You said that just a minute ago, right? Grace holds space for failure. And I think how this shows up in addiction is like I mentioned earlier, like recovery isn't a linear up and to the right thing where it's like, oh, I'm trying now, I'm never going to struggle again. Like relapse happens sometimes. We don't want it to happen. I don't want it to happen, but it does happen. But I think sometimes we tie how well we're doing to our validity. Like Like, I'm no good if I don't do things perfectly. But the reality is relapse doesn't erase my worth. It doesn't mean I'm not lovable. It doesn't mean I'm no good. It means that I still have room to learn and grow. And that's all of us. And so how grace holds that space for failure. It doesn't, like you've said this many times, like it doesn't give license to fail. Like, oh yeah, grace doesn't matter. Fail all you want. But it holds space for it, meaning like, okay, you failed. What can we learn, right? What consequence do we need to face? Yeah. So I'm curious. Yeah. How does that hit you? Is there anything different or an example even that comes to mind for you?
What comes to mind for me is grace is the tension we feel when we've identified. It's that tension between who you are and who you're becoming,
Mm-hmm.
and not getting those things mixed up with who you used to be. So who I am today is different than who I was 3 months ago, a year ago, this morning.
Mm-hmm.
But grace allows that space that you're talking about. And it is different. I use the word tension on purpose because there is a pressure that I know I personally feel when I'm going through something that's difficult, where something's been pointed out, like a shortcoming or a place that I need to grow, or I've messed up again, where healthy grace acknowledges, like, look, I know you're not, like, Austin, I know you aren't who you were 3 months ago. You're making improvement, and I know who you want to be, and I'm showing you the grace. But in order for me to show you the grace to help you get to where you want to be, I have to say what is true today about how you just acted, what you just did. And there's that tension point where I internalize that it's not, oh, I'll never improve. I need to remember where I was 3 months ago and how I have improved, but also know that I've got a ways to go. That's the tension of grace around failure. Failure isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of something new every time. We can look at it either way. That's what grace does. It shifts it from being I'll never improve type of failure to, like, this is an opportunity to grow again. And do I have the stamina and grit to continue to improve?
Man, that's good. So grace allows for honesty. Grace holds space for failure. The third point we want to make is that grace rebuilds identity. And what comes to mind here for me is internal family systems. You know, if anyone's interested in this point more, there's a book called Boundaries for Your Soul that really brings up, you know, the clinical theory of internal family systems and really applies it in a good biblical worldview. But it's seeing ourselves as parts. In other words, as a person, I'm more than just my addiction. There's parts of me that are really good, and maybe there's a part that's not, and I'm working on. But oftentimes we get so fixated on our problems that we see our whole self as one big problem. I am bad. I am terrible. And so grace rebuilds my identity, because if I can see myself as loved by God, and if there's people around me that are showing me grace, it begins to allow me to see that I am loved. I am good. There's good in me. There's good in you. And this part of me that's challenged, and there's this part of me that's dark, it's just that it's a part. It's not the whole thing. It's a part. It's a part. It's not the whole thing. And that's not to put that part into a room and forget about it. It's okay. This part needs to be cleaned out. This part needs to be addressed. This part needs to be fleshed out. I don't want to ignore this part, but just not to catastrophize it or blow it up in a sense that it's everything I am. Because your problem, your struggle isn't all of who you are. There's lots of parts of you, and so much of you is good. It's just this part of you needs addressed and needs to be worked on.
Yeah, I have a good example of that. When my oldest was really small, like four or five, she'd just lie incessantly about very small things. So it wasn't all the time. It was just very small things. And it was about what this is. It was a part of her where she was afraid to disappoint me or my wife, her mom, because she wanted our approval. She wanted to be, valued by us. And so identifying like, hey, I see that you messed up, but I still love you. Like you do not need to lie to protect your standing in this relationship. You're more important to me than the momentary frustration I'll feel about something. That's a part of her. So with us, it's identifying that if I am an incessant liar, that is a part of who I am. And I need to isolate it and look at why am I doing this? What is it in service to? Whereas these little lies were in service to protect a relationship, which is really important. So if I want to protect a relationship, what do I need to do? Be truthful.
Yeah. There's a healthier way to do it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the point. That's really good. That's a great example. So grace allows for honesty. Grace holds space for failure. Grace rebuilds identity. The fourth thing is grace restores relationships, right? We talk about this a lot. I mean, this is what we talk about every time we talk, a component of it, but we are relational beings. Grace gives us the fuel to rebuild relationships. If we're not grace filled, there is no way back to repair. There's no way back to repair. And that's, I think, what we see in people oftentimes is, especially people that bounce from friendship to friendship to friendship to friendship to friendship, they don't have these long lasting friendships. It's because they're friends until something bad happens, until that person lets me down or I let that other person down. And then that friendship's over. And that's a lack of grace. And sometimes, and again, don't hear me wrong. Some relationships end and sometimes that needs to happen. But my point is if that's a reoccurring theme that happens chronically throughout my life, it probably has something to do with this. And that is, in order to have a long-standing relationship, I'm going to let someone down at some point. Someone's going to let me down. And that doesn't mean that they're a bad person necessarily. It's that if I have a category for grace, it allows me to get curious, to press in, to try to understand where the other person's coming from, and hopefully for them to understand me so that we can aim at repair. Grace is always aimed at repairing, because there's going to be repairing that needs to be done with myself, with others, with God. And grace opens up the reality for restoration in relationships. And if we don't do that well, we are not going to be healthy. We're not going to be whole. We're not going to be able to exist in this relationship the way God intended, because God made us as relational beings.
It is the ability for us on our end, like what's on our side of the street. When we accept grace, we get to start the process of making peace with our own soul. Because if we can't accept grace, we'll never take that next step of taking a good hard look at like, why am I doing the things I'm doing? What's the motivation behind it? And instead of being appalled or down on yourself, you're able to see the goodness in yourself, which allows you to have that self-compassion. It's a huge struggle for me, where I can hear hear this thought come up about myself, and I have to catch it and be like, I hear this, but I'm just going to have you sit over here for a second and show myself a little bit of compassion. That doesn't mean I ignore the mistake. It's just like, give myself a little bit of a break so I don't treat myself poorly, so I can be more fully present with the person in front of me. And this is a little tongue in cheek, but like if you show someone grace and all they do is just throw it back at you and in a like self-deprecating, it's like, oh, I'm a piece of crap anyways, whatever, sure. I deserve you to hate me. Like that doesn't make me want to do that. Like show you grace. Like it pushes people away. If you're constantly saying like, oh no, it's like that self-denial is really unhealthy. And we might not verbally do it, but if we do it internally, it has the same impact on how we respond to things. So being able to catch that lack of self-compassion, lack of grace towards ourselves, we are stunting and doing real damage to the relationships that mean the most to us, even if we're not saying it out loud.
Totally. Grace allows us for honesty. Grace holds space for failure. Grace rebuilds identity. Grace restores relationships. Last point I want to make. Grace motivates change, right? And what we're trying to say here is everything embodied in this idea of grace is the only way we have a category for grace is because of God, is because of Jesus. Like God, for God so loved the world, he gave his son that whoever believes in him shall have lasting eternal life. Like it's this image of restoration, of taking what's broken and making it new. All of that is gracious and requires grace. God doesn't come to save the perfect. He comes because we were imperfect and we couldn't save ourselves. And so love is the fuel here. Love is such a better fuel for change than fear. And the reason I say fear is because most of us live by fear, not by love. We act because we're afraid. We act to try to push down and subdue our fear, right? And so how that manifests, I think a lot of times in recovery communities is people will say what you want to hear. Everything's hunky-dory, like there's always a smile on their face until it blows up. And it's because they weren't being honest, because they weren't living by grace, because they weren't, they're white knuckling their struggle. I do that. We've all done that. We've all been there. And it's like, if I know I'm loved and I'm in loving relationships, I can show up, right? It goes back to everything we've already said. I can be honest. I can own the reality that there's space for failure, right? I am not only my struggle. I'm being restored in relationship. And it's like love is a better fuel than fear, and living in love rather than fear. It's such a better motivation for change. I don't have to pretend. I don't have to put on a mask. I don't have to, whatever metaphor you want to use. True grace is a motivator for change. If I know I'm loved, I want to be better. Not I have to. Not I'm just doing this for my wife or my girlfriend or my kids. I can be honest about my struggle and this part of me that's unhealthy because I'm loved. And that's such a more powerful motivation for change than fear. Oh, I'm afraid I'm going to relapse. I'm afraid I'm going to mess up. I'm afraid I got to say the right thing. I've got to look a certain way. Like that's a short-lived reality.
Yeah, agreed. Yet fear can spark the desire for change or even start change. I think a lot of guys come to the refuge out of a fear, like, I don't want to go to prison. I don't want to lose this relationship. I'm afraid of ruining my life even more. I'm afraid of dying. Fear can spark the beginning of change. And I you were saying, what I hear you saying is love is that motivator. Love, and also at the same, love sustains that change, helps us get through the fact that I am going to screw up again.
It's long term. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm much more willing to be open about my failures when I know that I am loved, when I believe that, when I trust it. That's why love is that sustainer for change. So I think if guys want to like practical examples, it's probably why when we get frustrated with someone we care about, threatening them or trying to, scare them straight doesn't work. It's not a sustainable thing. It might get a momentary shift in behavior, or like, I'll do this because this guy's going to yell at me if I don't do this. But if it's based in a foundation of love and it's communicated clearly, you're going to see lifelong change because they're willing to put the effort in to remain in that relationship and see again that trust is being built by continually showing grace in appropriate ways, not ignoring the mistakes or sins or struggles, but pointing them out in a loving way because we care about them. That's the sustainable type of grace that helps people transform and change.
Yeah, it's so good. Well, good to be with you, man. In summary, grace allows for honesty. Grace holds space for failure. Grace rebuilds my identity to where I'm not only my addiction, I'm not only my struggle. Grace restores relationships, and grace motivates change. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Relational Recovery Podcast. We'll be back soon with a new conversation. See you then.